years ago talking about how to find a mate and those different things, and that I shouldn't date and not worry about having a boyfriend and trusting God to give me a mate. And after I heard you, I made a commitment to do what you preached. And I just wanted to, I saw you here and I wanted to catch you before you left and tell you I'm now married. My husband and I have a baby. I never had any other boyfriend but my husband. He never had any other girlfriends. We are so happy, and I just want to say thank you. Tonight, I want to tell you what she heard me preach. And I'll begin by telling you a beautiful story. Chad and Heidi Eves were married November 22nd, 1997 in Flint, Michigan. Their story was actually featured in an NBC Dateline segment titled My One and Only. A representative from NBC told Chad and Heidi's parents that their story was the most praised documentary ever done according to the feedback that the network received. The network received over 100 faxes and emails praising the segment and only 1 or 2 complaints. Chad and Heidi actually met in Flint, Michigan in January of '97 when Heidi's parents began driving 2.5 hours to the same church Chad's parents were attending. Chad's parents, Frank and Barb Eves, were driving 1.5 hours from Canada. Telling how it all happened, Chad's dad said this: it probably all started when Chad was about 12 years of age. I was talking with he and his brother about what was happening in society, and we were looking for a better way for them to get to the marriage altar. For about 3 years, we talked to them about the statistics in the world and the biblical perspective. By age 15, hear that age, that's critical, Chad had developed his own convictions and was saying things to us like this: why should someone waste their time going out with a lot of people they're not going to wind up with? They not only go through the highs and lows of emotions, but they're wasting a lot of time and money. Plus, you'd wind up comparing what you had in the past with what you're going to have in the future. Chad's father related to me a conversation Chad had with a 21-year-old fellow who had fathered a baby but had not married the girl. And Chad said, "You got a baby and you didn't marry the girl?" When the fellow asked his view, Chad said this: "I take the view I'm not going to go out with any girl till I find the one God directs me to, and then I'm going to marry her." The fellow laughed at Chad, but Chad stayed firm in his convictions. Mr. Eves told me Chad was a very strong-willed firstborn son. But about a year before the relationship with Heidi began, Chad said, "Dad, I want you and me to develop an even stronger relationship together." And they spent lots of time together. Heidi's dad told me that they began teaching Heidi the basic principles when she was younger. But about age 14, she made a commitment to do what they called courtship. When I asked Chad's mother, Barb Eves, to share with me how Chad came to realize Heidi was God's choice for his life, she replied, Chad and his brother had a ministry of just serving others. They'd just go and help people do whatever they needed to do. When they found out the Haydens were going to tear down a barn, the boys both went to help them do it. And while they were there, the Lord seemed to say to Chad, Heidi is to be your wife. Chad then prayed and sought God's will further. And a few days later, spring of '97, Chad told his dad, Dad, I think I've found the one. After discussing with Chad how he felt the Lord was leading him, Mr. Eves asked Chad to create a journal over the next several days wherein he would write whatever insights or thoughts or prayers the Lord seemed to impress on his heart. He would get alone in his room and read the Bible and pray, and whatever he felt God was saying to him, he would write it down. When I asked what the journal was like, he replied, it wasn't something super spiritual, it's just 5 to 10 pages of Chad's heart. In the early summer of '97, Chad's parents took Heidi's parents to dinner on a Friday evening. As they conversed at the table, Heidi's father commented that he had received a call the previous day from a fellow that I'll call Jerry, who was interested in Heidi. Jerry said, I hear you're looking for somebody for your daughter to date. The Haydens and Eves had a good laugh as Mr. Hayden told how he explained to Jerry that they didn't believe in dating at all. But he wound up setting a time the next Tuesday to meet with the young man to talk to him. Chad's parents looked at each other, then explained the reason they wanted to meet with the Haydens was because their son Chad felt like the Lord had spoken to his heart about their daughter Heidi. Though Chad didn't know it was going to happen, his dad gave Heidi's dad the journal that Chad had written. Also included in the journal were insights from Chad's brother and Chad's parents. The following Friday was the night that Mr. and Ms. Hayden often left all their children behind and went out together. With neither Heidi nor any of the other children knowing anything about what was going on, Mr. Hayden drove and met Chad while Mrs. Hayden visited with Chad's mother and got to know her better. For 3.5 hours, Mr. Hayden discussed, as Chad put it laughingly, Everything from what kind of toothpaste I used to what my greatest struggles were and my greatest victory. 3 different times over a period of 3 weeks, Chad and Heidi's dad met and talked for hours. Heidi still knew nothing. Even her brothers didn't know. Heidi's dad told me I didn't want Heidi's heart to be turning toward an individual till I had evaluated him. It would have made it difficult for her to keep her heart from turning toward Chad prematurely if the parties involved had not first objectively evaluated the situation. Chad told me that he actually grew a little more distant to Heidi outwardly during this time. Mr. Hayden said, "My wife decided before me." The journal actually helped convince her because it showed Chad's heart and that he was hearing from God. Another strong factor that influenced Mr. Hayden was the strong relationship he and his wife had with Chad's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Eves. On Saturday, 3 weeks after his first meeting with Chad, Mr. Hayden went on what he called a prayer walk. At that time, as he was praying, the Lord seemed to impress 2 verses on his heart that held separate key thoughts for him. "Oh, magnify the Lord with me, let us exalt His name together." And the other verse, "I sought the Lord, and He heard me and delivered me from all my fears." Any father who's ever considered a young man as a possible husband for his daughter knows that you have some fears at those times. Mr. Hayden took Heidi on a date that night. After discussing with her, as they had done in the past, the importance of discerning the character of others, Dad said, "Heidi, there's been a young man who's expressed an interest in starting a courtship with you." Now, Heidi had overheard part of the conversation when Jerry had called 3 weeks earlier, figured out who it was on the phone and why he might be calling. She told her dad later she immediately thought of Jerry and she was ready to say, "No, I'm not interested." Her dad continued, "And this young man is Chad Eves." Heidi looked at her dad and said, "Chad? Me?" And she began weeping. She was really quiet for a long time and then she said, "Yes, I would like that." When she got home that night, her mom greeted her with a question, "Did y'all have a good date?" And Heidi threw her arms around her mom's neck and said, "Mom, you knew this all along." Mr. Hayden called the Eves that night and told them Heidi's decision. Saturday night about midnight, Chad arrived home from work and Chad's mom said, "Chad, we need to talk." Chad said to me, "Pastor Davis," I looked at my mom and said, "Oh no." She said no, didn't she? And Mom smiled back and said, "No, son, actually," she said, "yes." Chad said, "I hardly slept that night." Chad's folks had moved from Canada to Michigan, but the family still lived an hour and a half apart. They agreed to meet at church on Sunday morning, 30 minutes earlier than usual, and with the new couple in the center, both sets of parents prayed for God's direction and blessing to be able to get started right, and then Chad and Heidi were given 30 minutes to talk. The new couple sat together in church, and during the fellowship time, similar to what we have here, the pastor asked if anyone had a testimony to give, and both fathers came forward and formally announced the beginning of the relationship. Chad and Heidi stood up before the congregation. Everyone applauded. Chad's dad clarified for me what was taking place from their perspective. He said, "When Chad went into this, it wasn't to see if she was the one. It was like this. We believe she is the one, and the purpose of this is marriage. We're not playing games." Several weeks later, the families made a trip together. Chad had purchased a beautiful diamond ring and wanted to formally ask Heidi to marry him. At Muskegon, Michigan, the couple walked out on a pier on Lake Michigan. Chad stepped over to a rock and then coaxed Heidi over to the rock. He said, "I wanted to be standing on the rock when I proposed." He did. Heidi said yes. Chad gave her the ring. And on November 22nd, 1997, Chad and Heidi touched and kissed for the first time at the marriage altar. Now, I know you have to agree with me that that's a beautiful story, and it's beautiful because it's biblical. As Chad and Heidi rode away from their wedding reception, one of the NBC crew said to Chad's father, "I've never been through anything like this in my life." Our last assignment before we came here to Michigan was in Alaska. We were in a town where 70% of the town was infected with sexually transmitted diseases. And the epidemic was traced back to the high school. We came from there to here, and here we see a biblical perspective. That's what the NBC crewman said. Mr. Hayden was telling me how they came to the decision to allow NBC to come. He said, "I knew this would bring a whole new level of pressure to bear on this whole situation. But we knew that God's goal through our family was to bring glory to Himself. And our goal as a family was to make